Hi guys, and welcome to the second video of this workshop. Today we're going to be talking about part 3, which mostly discusses Photoshop and photo editing. We're going to go pretty straight into this today. So just like I said yesterday, if you are really unfamiliar with Photoshop, like if you've never used it before, please view those videos in the video references. Those videos go way more in depth about how to use Photoshop, sort of like the nitty-gritty fine details of the software, sort of goes more into the details of how to use different things in Photoshop than this video will. This video is more just a demo on what we're doing for this project, so it won't cover as much of actual Photoshop as that other video. So the first assignment for Photoshop is to edit 3 photos within Photoshop. So you can do any sort of photo editing that you want. While you can just turn the images black and white, I think this is time to play with some photo editing that you normally wouldn't be able to do for projects and maybe learn something that you could do for a project in the future. First, I'm going to introduce you guys to 2 free stock photo websites that I think have really great collections of high quality photos that you can use without fear of like licensing issues. Photos can get quite expensive pretty quick. So if you're working on a project that needs a stock photo and you don't want to get into any trouble, these are great places to look. So the first one, this is Pexels, pexels.com. And, you can look for anything here. So for example, if I just search robot, there are tons of photos here, that you can use that are all really good quality. These also have some good search functions. So for example, if I was looking for like little girl smiling science, you can see that there's actually some photos that are kind of related. Little girl smiling science is a really specific search. And there's some photos that actually fulfill those, some things not as much. The second website that I'm going to direct you to is Unsplash. Unsplash is really similar. You can do the same thing. You can look for boy dancing DJ. So there's always an ad on top, so just make sure that, you aren't falling for this, but underneath there's a lot more photos of, the closest thing they can find to those terms. There are also other websites that do very similar things. It's definitely not limited to these 2. You can find a lot more. I personally find that these 2 have the best range of photos, and I normally can find what I'm looking for with these 2. But as long as you find what you're looking for, it doesn't really matter where you get it from. For this project, you don't necessarily have to use these websites to find photos. Since this is just sort of like a school project, it doesn't really matter if you just pull an image from Google Images or if you're choosing an image of your character. If you actually just use a picture of them, that's totally fine as well. So I already downloaded a couple of images from Unsplash and Pexels that I think will work for this demo. So I already downloaded this very cute photo of a beagle that I plan on using for this demo. I'm only going to show editing 1 photo for this demo just because it's going to be pretty repetitive and then the video will get really long. But I chose a beagle because Snoopy is a beagle. And I downloaded all of these images into a folder called PS for Photoshop images, and I have a couple high quality images that I found. Since I've saved them into the folder that we set up with another folder within, everything is still located in the same place. I won't lose anything. Digital hygiene, very important. Now I'm going to take my image and I'm just going to drag it directly into the Photoshop icon at the bottom of my computer. And this will open it directly into Photoshop. If you wanted to work at a certain size, you can of course set up a new file, make it the size that you want it, and then drag the photo into that document. So there's obviously so many different things that you can do in Photoshop. The brief of giving you guys just 3 photos to edit is super vague, I know, but basically just go ahead and run free and just try random things. There's literally no wrong answer for this, except not editing the photo at all, which is literally the wrong answer, but that's besides the point. So I'm just going to show some techniques that I do quite frequently in Photoshop, and hopefully you learn something. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select our background layer, which should be the only layer that exists right now, and I'm going to click Command J. So that just duplicates the layer. I always like to do this so that I have a backup to go to if I ever need to revert. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to File and I'm going to hit Save As. I'm just starting this early so I don't forget to do it later. I'm going to label this number 3, Snoopy PS01. So if I did the other two, I would just do 3 Snoopy PS02 and then PS03. So everything's ready to go. So the first thing I'm going to do with this Snoopy image is I'm going to use the pen tool, which is P on the keyboard, and I'm just going to trace around this dog. Okay, now that I've completely encircled this doggy, I'm just going to hit mask. So you'll see that this just cut out the dog. That's not what I wanted. I'm going to Command Z, and over here where these 2 squares overlay, there's a bunch of different options. I actually wanted combine shapes, and I'm going to hit mask again, and that'll get rid of the background and leave the dog. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to apply a gradient map to this dog. I think gradient maps are a really easy way to get a cool effect on a photo. It works really well for like editorial stuff and like social media stuff. So it's a very handy tool to know. So I'm just going to go over here to this little circle that's divided in half. These are adjustment layers, so they actually work as a layer rather than affecting the layer that you want the effect on. So for example, I'm going to select gradient map here down at the bottom. So before I actually go into editing the gradient map, you'll see that the gradient map is opened as a layer itself. So I can turn it off and the image layer is still perfectly fine. It's not directly affected. Turning it back on, I'm going to double select this gradient right here and double click that again. Now I'm able to adjust the gradient map however I want it. I didn't have anything really specific in mind, so I just sort of chose 2 random colors that look cool and then applied them. I'm going to turn off this gradient map layer off real quick. There are other adjustment layers that I use more often that sort of just fix images, you know, if it's badly lit or if the contrast is a little weird or if I just want to style it a little bit but not make it super weird. So here in the adjustment layers, you'll see that, you know, there's brightness and contrast, levels, curves, exposure, and then even the hue and saturation and color balance. Those are tools that I use quite a lot to just sort of edit the image in a very like photo editing way, not in like a crazy design way. So I'm just going to hit levels over here. So you can sort of change the contrast and lighting of an image. I'm not going to do this too much since I actually think that the lighting in this photo is quite good. I'll lighten it a little bit and then I'm going to select brightness and contrast. I'm going to increase the contrast a little bit and then make it a little brighter again. And then hue and saturation, this is one that you'll probably end up using a lot. You can, you know, decrease the saturation, make it a black and white image, or you can, you know, change the color hues of the dog altogether. I'm just going to get rid of that since I don't really want to mess with the hue and saturation for this layer. Alright, so I'm going to turn my background on again and you'll see that the lighting effects actually affect all of these layers, so both of these. One way to get around that is actually selecting the layer that you want affected, going into image and going into adjustments. And you know, this has pretty much the same layer adjustments as the adjustment layers, but when you apply these, so I'm just gonna do, you know, crazy brightness and contrast, they apply directly to the layer and you'll see that the background layer actually isn't affected. So the reason why I would say you should use those adjustment layers to edit the photo when you can, instead of making those changes directly onto the layer, is because the adjustment layers are non-destructive. What that means essentially is that at any point you could adjust these brightness and contrast again by double clicking, and you can revert your changes, whereas, there's no way to actually edit it again here. But say you still only want the brightness and contrast and the levels to affect this one layer and not the background. How you can do that actually is selecting all the layers that you want to only affect that layer and make sure that that layer is below it. Right click and create a clipping mask. So essentially the clipping mask will just match everything that's been selected above the base layer and crop it to fit whatever the shape of the base layer is. Clipping masks are super helpful, and I recommend you basically get comfortable using them because you will use them quite often if you do any sort of photo image making. I didn't really like the way that this contrast and levels affected the image after the gradient map, so I'm just going to select both of them, hit backspace on my keyboard, and delete them. So now we've got our dog colored in like a funny fashion. Now we can do the background. I'm just going to copy and paste this image. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the background layer again, and I'm going to turn off all the layers above it. I'm going to right click and I'm going to convert this to a smart object. I'm just going to double click it and it'll open it up in a new tab. So the smart objects basically allow you to edit a layer and do whatever you want to it, and it sort of packages it all together and then allows you to have it put into the original file, but in sort of a non-destructive way. So for example, over here, I can create a new layer just down here, use my brush tool and draw all over this. And then when I hit save, it'll show up here again in the main file. If I delete that layer and I save again, when I go back to the main file, once again, it looks exactly the way that it did in the other file. But I actually wanted to try something with this smart object, so I'm going to go here and change the brightness and contrast of this photo. I'm mainly focusing on the background, so I'm ignoring what the beagle will look like in the front. I'm going to go to mode, go to grayscale, merge, and then I'm going to go to bitmap, flatten layers, halftone screen, 150. So you'll see I just made sort of this halftone pattern with this. The bitmap tool is really helpful. It's something that you'll see a lot of CalArts students use because it's really handy with screen printing. And I'm just going to save this. And then when we go back, we'll see that, yes, that's exactly what we wanted. So now we've got this sort of like funky texture in the background that still goes with our photo. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create another gradient map over the bitmap pattern. So that's pretty funky and weird. I'm just going to go in and adjust that original gradient map a little bit more now that we've created a background. All right, so that's pretty fine by me. One last thing I'm just going to show you real quick. So for each of these masks, you'll see that there's this sort of white panel next to whatever the layer thing is. This is the actual mask. So you'll see over here down in the bottom left, there's this black and white color palette, and you can, double click to change these colors. You can basically use these colors to adjust the mask of whatever you're editing. So the gradient map here obviously is the coloring on this top layer. I'm going to select B for brush, and I'm going to change the flow so everything is 100%. And you'll see that I have black selected. When I, paint over anywhere on this mask, it'll show up here in the white panel, and you'll see that it actually erases whatever I drew black on. When I reverse, that's Shift X, and I choose the white instead, wherever I paint, I can actually re-add that color. So once again, up here, you can see wherever things are painted and where things have been painted out. This can be pretty cool if you use brushes that are a little bit, more like an airbrush. You can do something cool that sort of fades in whatever the mask layer does. And then if you erase too much, you can just switch and add a little bit back in. And you can adjust, of course, the opacity and the flow down a little bit if you think you had too heavy of a hand. A lot of this stuff takes some fussing and finessing, so, no rush with any of this. And that's an example of, a photo that's edited in Photoshop. You don't have to do as many things as I did in one image, since, you guys have to do 3 of them. Just take this as a starting point of some stuff that you can do. I'm going to end with hitting Command S, save. Okay, so the next part of this is we're going to make a photo collage. And that's really not that different from, just editing photos. We're just basically combining a bunch of photos and other elements however we want. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a file. It doesn't really matter the size that you make it, but if you're planning on this filling up like a whole page of your book, I would make it the size of your book. So for example, my book is 6 by 8 inches. I'm just going to make it to that. Once again, with color modes, if you're planning on printing this, I would work in CMYK. If not, RGB is fine. If you're putting this into a CMYK book, it'll also convert it, so it's really not that big of a deal. And I'm going to hit create. All right, so we've got this blank canvas. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our adjustment layers, and I'm going to add a solid color. I like to work with the solid colors because it's just an easy way to change the background color, and you can make it whatever color you want. I'm just going to go with this sort of lightish blue color. Next, you'll want to import some images for your collage. All right, so I've got a number of images here, and you'll see that they're all smart layers because they're actually dragged in from my Finder folder, and the file actually exists here in my computer. If I just copied and pasted an image from the internet, it would not show up as a smart object. If the smart object thing is annoying to you because maybe, you want to paint on one of these layers, you can always right click and rasterize the layer. Rasterizing it will make it a normal type of layer. So you're probably going to do a lot of collaging at CalArts, so this is why this is part of the project. I find that collage is something that looks really simple, but is something that's pretty difficult to master. So often there's a lot of thinking that you want things to look one way, but then ending up having to find the perfect image at the right angle for a really long time. There's really no need to get stuck on all that for this workshop. Just combine some stuff that has a couple of objects from, your story or your universe about your character. I'm going to play this as a time lapse, so then the video is shorter, but I will stop and explain anything if I feel like it needs to be explained. you'll see when I move it around, since it's just a mask of the image, the actual transform box is surrounding what the original size of the image is, and that can be pretty tedious. I'm just going to select the mask, and I'm going to hit rasterize vector mask and then apply layer mask, and do the same thing for these two. So now it's just little JPEGs of this. There's no more mask, it's just cropped to that. Before I move any further, I'm just going to hit Command S. I have my sky image selected, and I'm actually going to rasterize it. And then I'm going to go into filter, go to noise, and add noise. But you'll see that there's a ton of different filters that you can use here. I would explore with some of these, and you can even use them for when you're making your 3 photo edited photos. There's a bunch of random stuff that you can use here. I find that adding a little bit of noise adds a lot to a photo, especially collages, because they add sort of this tactile texture to it. If you're having trouble making all the images feel like they're cohesive, sometimes adding a little bit of noise or the same level of noise to each layer will help it feel a little bit more cohesive. I'm just using the lasso tool here to move each of these peanuts a little bit separate from each other. And between selecting them, I am hitting Command D to clear the selection. I hope you see what I mean by, taking a character and then just sort of running with it. So like the clouds are from the Peanuts universe. Snoopy is a beagle. They often play football in it. And then Peanuts, is the name of the comics, and there's literal peanuts here. So things don't have to be like directly taken from the universe of your character or have to actually directly depict your character, but just playing around and, using whatever you can find, making something fun out of it is just the name of the game. Make sure you hit save before finishing up your collage. In the next video, we will be talking about creating a poster, which basically combines all of the skills that we had learned so far, and then we will be moving things into InDesign. And then that'll literally be it for this workshop. So at this point, you're probably around halfway done, but you've basically done all the heavy lifting for creating the components, and then afterwards, you just need to put it all together. If you found it difficult to keep up with what I was doing today in this demo, make sure that you watch the video references that are linked in the syllabus. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to email me and, ask your question or schedule a time to meet with me. Or if you want, you can also look it up on Google and see if you find answers there. There's obviously millions of tutorials on YouTube and, millions of tutorials on Google. So that's going to be it for this video. Hope you learned something new. Hope you're excited about what you're making. I'm definitely excited to see what you guys make. And I'll see you guys in the next video where we talk a little bit about creating a poster and talk about putting everything into InDesign and wrapping this project up. Good luck and get out there.